Welcome, everyone, and good evening. Nancy, go ahead.
Thanks, Tegan. Hi, I'm Nancy Gagne. I'm the Executive Director of the Community Coalition on Race. If you're new to us, I encourage you to learn more about us by visiting our website, communitycoalitiononrace.org, and also to learn about Soma Justice. You'll see their logo on the bottom of some of these slides as well. They're a co-sponsor with us tonight. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this Black History Month panel to learn more about this important topic. And I am going to say the word, reparations. Clearly, it's a word that brings out some of the best in those who work on racial justice issues, but we know that it also brings out a lot of hate, bigotry, and denial about the causes of persistent racial wealth gaps. Even in New Jersey, where we're fortunate to have strong interest in a reparations task force by a number of elected officials, others have stayed away from using the word reparations, choosing phrases like wealth disparity instead. The New Jersey Assembly and the Senate bills to establish a reparations task force are worth reading, and I'm sure you'll learn about some of that tonight, and I'll post the links later in the chat. Tonight, we are here to learn what it takes and how it is possible to repair the inequities perpetuated by laws, policies, and cultural segregative practices that cause generational harms. And I am so grateful for all that we're going to hear tonight, and that we will be led in our discovery by Lori Beacham and Khalil Gibran Muhammad. And now we are going to give you some Zoom rules.
Thanks so much, Nancy. And just to give you an overview of the evening, we're going to start with the Zoom rules and the ways in which we make this platform as community friendly as possible. We'll move then into our speaker introductions. We'll have our panel discussion. Then we'll move into the Q&A, and I'll say more about that in just a moment. Our panelists will wrap up, and as we always do as we close, we will invite you to give us your feedback. We always do appreciate that, so stay tuned. You'll hear more about that a little bit later. As Nancy mentioned, we're going to be offering you some Zoom instructions. We know that the last 2 years have made everybody probably more familiar than they ever wanted to be with Zoom. That said, we ask that you put your screen on speaker view. If you don't know how to do that, just click on the view icon in the upper right-hand corner and choose speaker view. That'll allow you to focus on the person who is speaking. And then we're going to ask that when we get to the point in our conversation tonight that we are doing questions, we're going to ask that you submit those questions via chat. You can submit them directly to me, to Tegan Color, and submit them via private chat. And I see on the screen that I was typing quickly and typed private cat. Please submit them via private chat at any time during the discussion. When it occurs to you, send them to me, and we'll try and get a broad cross-section. This allows us to make sure that we don't have any duplicates. And when we call on you, if your question is selected, we'll call your name out, and at that point we'll invite you to unmute your microphone, and please do at that point enable your camera so that we're able to see who's speaking. And we'd like to ask you to read your question. We do ask that you stick to the question that you submitted and not deviate from that, please. Then the program, including question and answer, is being taped tonight. By participating, you give us your permission to videotape you. And that is all I have. So now I'm going to turn things over to Antoine Green, who's going to introduce our first speaker. Antoine, you're muted.
Good. Let's try that again. Good evening, everyone. Khalil Gibran Muhammad is the Ford Foundation Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. He directs the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project and is the former director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, a division of the New York Public Library and the world's leading library and archives of global Black history. Before leading the Schomburg Center, Khalil was an associate professor at Indiana University. Khalil's scholarship examines the broad intersections of racism, economic inequalities, criminal justice, and democracy in U.S. history. He is currently co-directing a National Academy of Sciences study on reducing racial inequalities in the criminal justice system. His writing and scholarship have been featured in national print and broadcast media outlets such as the New Yorker, Washington Post, The Nation, National Public Radio, PBS NewsHour, Moyers and Company, MSNBC, and the New York Times, which includes his sugar essay for the 1619 Project. He has appeared in a number of feature-length documentaries, including recently released Amend, The Fight for America, the Oscar-nominated 13th, and Slavery by Another Name, Khalil was an associate editor of the Journal of American History and an Andrew W. Mellon Fellow at the Vera Institute of Justice. He is a member of the Society of American Historians and the American Antiquarian Society. Khalil is an award-winning teacher at Harvard and has received numerous honors for his commitment to public engagement, like the one we are experiencing tonight. Khalil, thank you so much. I want to start off with our first question. Can you give us some history of anti-Black racism and efforts to achieve reparations in the United States?
Sure. Well, it's always great to be with the hometown crowd. So thank you, Antoine, for that great introduction. It was a little longer. I have to send you the short version since many people on this call will know me very well. In any case, I think this is a really terrific program for CCR, and I think this is a good time to bring clarity to both the history and context for where the debate about reparations is today, and also the fact that we have business before the state around the issue of reparations. So I'm delighted to be joined this evening and be in conversation with Lori Beacham from the New Jersey Institute of Social Justice and one of our own legislators. So I'll try to do this in broad strokes because there's a lot to be said for the details, which I do think matter. And, we'll kind of get into that, I think, as we compare the past to the present. But the first thing I want to say is that the effort for reparations is not new. And interestingly, most people know the story of 40 Acres and a Mule, which was not simply a field order by General Sherman, but in fact, the brainchild of several African-American leaders during the Civil War who told Lincoln in a private meeting that the best way to move forward, both in enacting the war itself to victory, but also in ensuring that African-Americans would be on solid footing after the Civil War, was to distribute 40 acres of land to them. This took place briefly in parts of South Carolina, but was doomed shortly after the repeal of the order. And the irony of that moment in the midst of the Civil War in the 1860s, of the possibility for land grants. I thought I muted myself so that I can't be disturbed. So Apple's failing me. Let me try this again. In the moment where land grants would become the basis for giving African Americans economic mobility, they didn't call it reparations, but they understood that for the unrequited toil for generations of African Americans, there was no way to ensure that they themselves would have the independence, the financial independence they needed to carve lives for themselves. Shortly thereafter, at the end of the Civil War, African Americans like Callie House, who was born in 1861, began to organize based on the model of Civil War pensions to veterans of the Civil War. And so if we think about the distribution of federal resources to those who had fought as soldiers to defend the Union and therefore in the end to end slavery, Former ex-slaves like the woman Callie House, who was born in Tennessee, said, among others, that we should establish a similar model for African Americans, not just for those who fought in the war, but in general. And so they established something called the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension. And by 1915, and I'm going to give a big number because it's the number they came up with, they estimated that then roughly 2 million people who had actually been enslaved and were still alive were due $68 million in recompense or reparations for slavery. That number today, just to give some context, according to inflation calculators, would be about $1.8 trillion today just for that population. And what's interesting about this is one of the legal arguments, of course, against cash payments or direct payments of reparations today is essentially a statute of limitations argument, that those who were directly harmed are no longer with us and those who were the direct perpetrators are no longer with us. So there are two ways to look at this, and this is one of the arguments that has continued through the story of reparations. One, that the federal government continued with policies of racism that perpetuated the inequalities that began in slavery. And so one of the things I want to say in this opening conversation before Lori begins to put some meat on the bones of New Jersey's own history, we need to broaden the conversation about reparations because it isn't just about slavery. It is both the debt owed from slavery, from 100 years of formal segregation for the vast majority of African Americans, let alone de facto or informal segregation, which took place outside of the South. And then the legacy effects and continuing dynamics of financial sector, housing sector, educational sector, systemic forms of or structural forms of racism. And so when we talk later about what's happening in the country today, I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like when we put a little bit more meat on the bones. In a remaining time, I just want to point out that we also have evidence from prior efforts to establish truth commissions that would have led potentially to reparations. And so the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre in 1921, which most people understand to be an outright pogrom directed against the Black community, where the entire financial basis of that community, aside from an estimated 300 lives lost, resulted in an actual harm. That harm was brought to courts of law in the 1990s by the former legal scholar Charles Ogletree, and they established a commission to look into it. Ogletree lost the lawsuit, but the city of Oklahoma agreed that a harm had been committed and recommended reparations, which to this day have never been paid. A similar process took place in Rosewood, Florida, which I actually think preceded the Tulsa, Oklahoma. What's interesting about those two cases is those are just two of the most well-known instances of racial massacres against Black people. But it happened in Elaine, Arkansas. It happened in Chicago, Illinois. It happened in Philadelphia. It happened in Harlem at various points. And I'm not talking about the Harlem of 1964. I'm talking about the Harlem of the 1930s or the Harlem of 1905. So when we begin to document the actual state-abetted or state-directed violence against Black communities, then we begin to recognize that we should move past simply trying to legislate an argument or base an argument on whether or not we can actually and fairly or even legally atone first and then repair and redress the harms done in the context of slavery. One last thing I'll say is that the precedent for reparations, better known, but always important to remind people, began as early as the colonial period. The women who were unjustly executed in the midst of the Salem witchcraft trials, their families were given reparations based on the Massachusetts legislative decision in 1725. The first people to receive reparations for slavery were actual slave owners, white men who owned slaves in DC in the 1860s when Congress legislated that slavery would be abolished in the midst of the Civil War. We also see examples of more recent cases. The Japanese internment survivors received about $20,000 each for those who were still alive in the 1988 congressional bill. And then more recently, we've seen examples of universities that have acknowledged their harm for slavery. I'll stop with that broader context for why we are here today, and we'll come back to more questions about how do we move forward. Thank you. Thank you, Antoine, for the great question.
Hello, can people
you.
see me?
Yes, we can. And now we will have our second introduction by Ms. Barbara Velasquez.
Okay, hello, everybody. I'm glad you could make it. I'm really very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce our next panelist. I've been getting to know her through our joint activities on the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice's Coalition of Allies for Reparations Task Force. Lori Beacham is the Director of Communications for the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. Lori began her career practicing law, and this thing just covered up what I was reading. So let me get my piece of paper. Lori began her career practicing law, followed by 10 years as a television producer at Court TV, where she covered trials of well-known figures, including Jack Kevorkian, Michael Jackson, and President Bill Clinton during his impeachment. After working in television, she moved to nonprofit work, first serving as communications director at the Center for Justice and Democracy, an organization devoted to protecting the civil justice system. After that, Lori headed up the Media Relations Department at the National ACLU, where she garnered coverage of the organization's work in major print, TV, and radio outlets, and worked on issues including racial justice, immigration, voting rights, reproductive freedom, and national security. Before joining the Institute, she led the Strategy and Campaigns Department for the National ASPCA, where she oversaw animal welfare campaigns that incorporated communications, marketing, legislative, regulatory, and litigation initiatives. Lori also served as media director for New Jersey 11 for Change, a grassroots organization that advocates for constituents of the 11th Congressional District, which now includes South Orange and Maplewood. She received a BA degree in sociology with a minor in women's studies from Brandeis University and a JD from New York University School of Law. So with that, we'll welcome Lori Beacham, and we'll start with your first question, which is, well, Dr. Muhammad shared some very interesting history with us. And even as a northern, even though New Jersey is a northern state, it does not have a really good history when it comes to slavery and racism. So could you share a little bit of this history and of New Jersey's role in this area?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Barbara, and good evening to everybody. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. As Barbara said, I'm Lori Beacham, Director of Communications at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, and I am going to situate the conversation about reparations here in New Jersey, as well as talk about the current effort to get a bill passed to create a reparations task force in our state. So you would think a conversation about reparations would start 400 years ago, but I'm actually going to start by talking about the New Jersey of today and then tie that all together. I am going to use some visual aids here, so I'm going to share my screen. And if someone could tell me, is that everybody can see that?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So the slide you're looking at here was created by our Institute designer. As you can see, it depicts a young boy standing on a cracked foundation. And it says the cracks of structural racism are erupting as earthquakes in Black and other communities of color. We created this image when the pandemic began, and we saw immediately that the pandemic, like many other things we might not suspect it about, was a racial justice issue. And we realized that generations and generations of structural racism, like cracks in our foundation, were erupting. And they were manifesting as alarmingly disproportionate racism. I'm sure you've heard of sickness and death from COVID-19 among Black people and other communities of color. And this was no accident. It's happened in New Jersey as well. And it's, you know, sadly not surprising when you realize how weak our foundation was with cracks from the structural racism. So let me see. Okay, so this slide shows some other ways that the cracks in our foundation manifest in New Jersey, where despite kind of the progressive halo that we have here in our state, we actually have some of the worst racial disparities in all of America. And so what you see here is an image of a young boy facing a tall staircase and the enormous climb he has in front of him due to the disparities that he needs to overcome. I know this is a lot to take in on a slide, but you can find it on our website as well. Focusing on one of these disparities, the net wealth for Black people in New Jersey is $179. So think about net wealth, $179, and think about what things you pay that much for sometimes on a daily basis in your own life. And this is compared to over $106,000 for New Jersey's white people. And I will say that in just a few weeks, we'll be releasing a new report that will update these numbers, but the racial disparity actually remains quite consistent. So we know that this disparity is not a result of personal behavior and personal choices. And as Khalil was referring to, it does date back to the caste system that began with slavery, but it has been reinforced time after time, generation after generation, policy after policy. What you're seeing here is one report that we did, Erasing New Jersey's Red Lines, which talked about how we had a racially exclusive system for the distribution of property in New Jersey since we began. So you might be wondering how all this can be true in New Jersey. As I said, we like to think of ourselves as pretty enlightened and progressive, and certainly in some ways we are, but I hate to burst our New Jersey bubble when it comes to racial equity in our history, sadly, not so much. The next image you're seeing here is from a Salon article. It's a stark image, but it depicts the fact that while it's true in northern states, that we're a northern state, New Jersey was actually an enthusiastic participant in slavery. From its founding when it was called the New Netherlands as a Dutch colony, and even after when English successors renamed it New Jersey, promoting slavery was hardwired into the state's political economy. New Jersey, of course, as we know, did fight on the Union side in the Civil War, but it was arguably the most enthusiastic northern state when it came to holding on to slavery years after other northern states had ended it. Just before the end of the Civil War, New Jersey even voted down the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, only to ratify it in 1866 after the end of the Civil War and Lincoln's assassination months earlier. So all of this not so proud distinction has actually led New Jersey to be called the slave state of the North. Not surprisingly, after the Civil War ended, there was an effort to whitewash our investment in slavery. The history professor, Jim Gigantino, says when we talk about slavery in modern times, we talk about emancipation or abolition of slavery. He's referring to in New Jersey. This is a purposeful reinvention of New Jersey as part of the Free North narrative of participation in the Underground Railroad, participating in this freedom process. So here, and again, I went back and forth about whether to share this because I know you can't possibly read it all and we don't have time to go through it all, but just the visual to show you the timeline in New Jersey from when we were founded as a colony in 1664, then to the early to mid 1800s when we had a cottager system, and on to denying the people the right to vote who had criminal convictions, and then restrictive covenants in terms of property, then redlining, which actually persists today, an exclusion from the GI Bill, even the Great Recession, and then leading all to the same disparities that you saw before. So just to focus on a few of these, New Jersey provided each English white settling family with 100 acres of land and an additional 60 for each enslaved Black person who would work on that land. By the 1800s, more than 2/3 of all enslaved Black people in the North were held captive here in New Jersey. And after becoming the last northern state to end formal slavery, we developed our own form of sharecropping. We can see a direct line from the enslavement of Black people in New Jersey to sharecropping, restrictive covenants, denial of home ownership opportunities through the GI Bill, Jim Crow segregation, redlining, exclusionary zoning policies, predatory lending practices, all leading up to today's shameful racial wealth gap. What you're seeing here, and there are places like this throughout New Jersey. This is in Camden, a sign marker showing, as you can see, enslaved Africans once sold here. What you're looking at here is a posting in Newark from 1799, offering a reward for the capture of an enslaved Black man. So with that, I am going to pause now, and we will talk a little bit, I think later in the evening, I'll get back to efforts to repair this harm in New Jersey. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lori. Khalil, there were several social movements during the 19th and 20th century. And I think Lori touched on a couple during her presentation. Can you talk to us about some of the missed opportunities where reparations could have been addressed?
Thank you, Antoine. Yeah, so I've already talked about efforts beginning, from the very moment when slavery is on life support, of a missed opportunity. I also want to call out, because Lori mentioning the distribution of either free or very low cost land to white settlers in New Jersey was also a federal policy in the Homestead Act of 1862 that essentially distributed more than 1 million acres to white settlers in exchange for displacing indigenous populations, particularly west of the Mississippi. Economists estimate that land theft and redistribution to white families amounts to part of the asset holdings nationally of about 45 million white Americans to this day. And another way to look at missed opportunities is also to think about not quite as reparations, but as the beginning of a process of equal distribution. And so there's another particular milestone which occurs when America's much more robust social safety net is born in the midst of the New Deal, which establishes the basis that most people know of Social Security, unemployment insurance, also allows for collective bargaining rights, and is part of an alphabet of opportunities from the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which provided subsidies for farmers whose crops were not well compensated in depressed markets, agricultural markets, paid workers essentially not to work, white workers in particular, and ultimately formed the basis of the housing policies that made credit cheap and loan terms much longer, which made housing more affordable. This is the story of redlining. I'm just adding that we don't often think about the movement to be included in distribution policies. We talk about the consequence of redlining, but there's all this federal money that is being poured into creating economic security for white people. And so for the average white citizen today, whose home is the nest egg that has provided a measure of economic security, and I'm not saying every white person is wealthy, but a measure of economic security that might allow a child to go to college, that might allow someone to weather the storm of an illness or a broken bone or some other medical tragedy that befalls a member of one's household. Black people simply haven't had that asset. And the leaving them out of that asset now becomes the basis of the debt owed. So let me talk a little bit about a social movement that is happening right now and the way in which some people nationally are beginning to define these terms. I'm going to draw almost singularly on Sandy Darity's work, or William Darity at Duke University, because I am not a reparations expert. And I'm learning from people who have dedicated their time to looking under the hood of what is possible. So I'm just going to lift up a few highlights from his own work. The first thing I'll say is that he defines 4 conditions of reparations, really 3 primary principal conditions, which are acknowledgement. There must be a process of truth telling, which can take the form of truth commissions, which is partly what I know the New Jersey Institute of Social Justice and the legislators are pushing for. So first, to simply take stock of what happened. The next would be a process to recognize redress, that is to make due or to repair the harm. And that can take many forms, but many more people today are recognizing that money has been the principal instrument for essentially repairing harm internationally and globally for a very long time. And so the notion somehow that the United States should not pay Black people for harms committed in the name of the state, whether it's local, state, or federal, is an absurdity when in every possible way in this country, I'll just give a contemporary example, Big Pharma, the Sackler family, responsible for hundreds of thousands of lives lost and hundreds of thousands of lives ruined. And many of them are not going to face criminal prosecution, but they're going to pay billions of dollars out of their company's wealth. And so we recognize the importance of money as a measure of accountability. The third would be closure, according to these principles. That is to say that once the debt has been paid, then the argument in favor of future reparations would end only in the instance of which there would be no further harm. And finally, the question about reparations themselves has to answer who's eligible, how much, who should pay, and in what form. We've talked about what form, so I won't mention that again. The eligibility question is somewhat controversial. Sandy Darity believes that eligibility should rest with people who can trace their lineage back to US slavery from the colonial period through the antebellum period. And that would take the process of a genealogical agency stood up by the federal government to use professional genealogies. He likes to say colloquially, if Skip Gates can find everybody's roots, so can a group of professional genealogists to do this. So eligibility under Darity's understanding would be limited. Now, there are reasonable arguments legislatively for this, which is to say you can identify the jurisdictions for which the United States is directly responsible, as compared to a broader conversation about Afro-descended people who happen to live in the United States today, who may not have arrived since the 1960s or the 1970s or the 1980s. Not to say that they haven't been subject to systemic discrimination, but perhaps the payment and the process would look different for them. The next question of how much, I'll just cut to the chase. Darity uses an argument based on contemporary evidence of the racial wealth gap. He wants us to know there are 2 ways to look at this. There's the median household wealth and there is the average household wealth. It's complicated, but the short version is median favors a smaller gap because the middle position doesn't account for the fact that you have huge maldistribution in a large population of poorer whites and a very small population of well-to-do whites. So to account for that, he prefers an average difference. Using the average. Now, he has some really striking notes here. I'm just going to read directly because it's really powerful. And I think this will put some meat on the bones of what Lori's going to add when she talks about this. So 25% of white households have a net $1 million of wealth compared to 4% of Blacks. The poorest whites in the lowest quintile, the lowest 20% of the wealth distribution, have a higher level of median wealth than all Black households taken together. I'll say that again. The poorest whites in the lowest quintile have a higher level of median wealth than all Black households put together. And so whenever people point to Oprah or Jay-Z or Gagne or Beyonce and say, if they can do it, so can you, look at these Black billionaires, the numbers don't add up. They simply don't add up because the real source of wealth distribution is not at the extremes. The real source of wealth distribution is exactly in the cumulative advantage given to whites over centuries. And it's everyday whites. And so you can still be poor in this country and still have net assets coming to you that may not feel like you're living high on the hog, but in their aggregate effect means you are fundamentally well off. So the number you're all waiting for, the number he estimates that if we were to use the mean, every Black household that could trace its roots back to slavery would receive $840,000 tax-free in one payment. If they did it based on individuals, that would amount to $350,000 for every individual tax-free in one payment. Total cost, based on current population estimates, $14 trillion. Who can pay $14 trillion? Nobody. Not Michael Bloomberg, not Bill Gates, not Mark Zuckerberg, not Jeffrey Bezos, not Elon Musk, not the state of New Jersey, but the federal government can. And so the distribution of those funds would take place over an extended period of time. You asked the question, how much? I've given you. How would it happen? Potentially happen in cash payments and or annuities and or trust funds, depending on the age of the recipient and the decision made by Congress to do so. Finally, I'll say that we do have precedent in this country, both past and currently, for at least starting the process of these truth commissions. The Kerner Commission, according to some political scientists, is actually the first truth commission, both in the United States and was a model for others. We talk about South Africa, but in fact, the Kerner Commission is itself representative of a process to dig into the details of systemic oppression. Secondly, I'll note that in the wake of George Floyd, a number of places around the country committed themselves to some kind of truth commission process, which is not necessarily to lead to reparations, I want to make clear. And I think Lori's comments will help us see how New Jersey is approaching this. But we can just acknowledge that Maryland established a truth commission, which is underway. New York City under de Blasio announced a truth and racial justice commission. I attended one of its sessions led by Jennifer Jones Austin. Derek Hamilton, who's also well known at the New School, is doing some of the work on behalf of that Truth Commission. There are in total either both past, present, or proposed 20 US-based commissions happening in the country right now, including in Iowa, in California, and other places. So New Jersey would not be an outlier in this case. It would be slow in some ways to the game. Finally, the question about policy decisions versus reparations. Evanston, as you know, legalized marijuana, took the potential proposed future earnings from legalization of marijuana, set aside $10 million trust fund, or at least committed to building a fund, not a trust fund, a reparations fund that would then be used to subsidize grants up to $25,000 for home improvements or home purchases for the Black residents of Evanston. And this is somewhat controversial because the question of whether or not people should be restricted in how they get their reparations. In this case, one could argue that money will only help to further the white advantage and the disparity that exists in wealth for the white property owners whose property would increase if the homes in Evanston owned by Black people would increase. So I'll close on this point with Sandy Darity's argument, which I think is an important one and probably will come up in the Q&A, which is that trust Black people. And we have to decide to give them money that was owed to them. And that's the end of it. The notion that somehow they won't be responsible for it is itself part of the systemic racism that we're fighting against.
Thank you so much for that, Khalil. I hope you can all see me. So Khalil did talk about a number of reparations commissions around the country looking into this issue. And Lori, I wonder if you could talk to us about what's happening in New Jersey.
Yes, I would be more than happy to. Let me share my screen again. Okay. Okay, everyone can see? Yep, okay, great. So yeah, so the question becomes, how do we repair this harm? Khalil talked about efforts going on around the country. We're trying to do this in New Jersey. New Jersey did rightly issue an apology for slavery in 2008, which I is a very nice, important gesture, but of course, unfortunately does nothing to repair the harm in real life. So in late 2019, in partnership with advocates from all over the state of New Jersey, some of you partnered with us, we were successful in getting introduced legislation to form the Reparations Task Force that you've been hearing about. The picture you see right now is of the Institute's president and CEO, Ryan Haygood, on the day of that introduction, when we were all very hopeful and enthusiastic. The bill itself doesn't specify what the reparations would look like, the kind of things that Khalil was just talking about, but basically lays out what the reparations task force would do. So it would examine the institution of slavery within the state of New Jersey, the extent to which New Jersey and the federal government prevented, opposed, or restricted efforts of former enslaved persons and their descendants who were considered United States citizens to economically thrive upon the ending of slavery, examine the lingering negative effects of slavery, and research the methods and materials for facilitating education, community dialogue, acknowledgement, and other formal actions leading towards transformation, reparations, remedies, and a sense of justice and economic justice among the descendants of enslaved African people in this state. Then, of course, make recommendations for what remedies should be awarded, through what instrumentalities, and to whom they should be awarded, some of the questions that Khalil addressed, and address how said recommendations comport with national and international standards of remedy for wrongs and injuries caused by the state. So while it doesn't say exactly what reparations should look like, clearly everybody asks that question and says, are we talking about writing checks? Are we talking about the kind of financial remuneration Khalil addressed? And at the Institute, we say, absolutely, yes, we are talking about writing checks. We also say that it has to be writing checks and, so writing checks and policies that repair harm through investments in communities of color that can look like all sorts of things. Ultimately, that will be up to the task force to decide. They will be looking at New Jersey's unique history, the unique ways that slavery affected us, and the policies that have come through the generations after that. But, and then whatever they recommend would have to be enacted and passed, possibly by the legislature. But those are the kind of things that we're looking at. But even though the bill simply calls for a task force, a conversation, a study, it's been quite an uphill climb. So Assembly Speaker Craig Coughlin asked us about the task force. Do you really have to call it that? Do you have to say the word reparations? Can you just call it a racial justice task force? Something else? Do you have to use that word? And that question, which is obviously born from fear of controversy, actually shined a light on exactly what the problem is, that New Jersey has not faced up to its history like the rest of the country. And we have not had a process of truth, reconciliation, and repair. And if we just keep avoiding the conversation, if we keep avoiding calling it what it is, we'll never get there. So thus was born the campaign, Say the Word Reparations. And the campaign has grown into a multi-race, multi-faith coalition throughout the state. Here you see in one of Ryan's tweets, quoting Reverend Anya Semler Michael from the Unitarian Church in Montclair. Everyone in New Jersey has benefited from or been harmed by slavery. I have benefited. Governor Murphy, you have benefited. Speaker Coughlin, you have benefited. New Jersey must pass the Reparations Task Force bill now. We have a coalition of faith allies for Say the Word Reparations that have been amazing. So this is a quote from Rabbi Weisberg from the Temple B'nai Abraham in Livingston. We have to repair what was done as Americans here for generations are new. The responsibility falls on all of us, and I urge us all to support the Reparations Task Force bill. The coalition has held rallies throughout the state over the last 2 years. This was one on Juneteenth in Newark. We walked from the Lincoln statue to City Hall, where we had quite a good turnout, as you could see, and an amazing lineup of speakers, including including Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman, and also our New Jersey Lieutenant Governor Sheila Oliver, who said the conversation has to be about reparations. Our Lieutenant Governor said the word. This was in Perth Amboy, where we had another rally. And this rally was, well, first of all, Perth Amboy was both a major port for slavery and a stop on the Underground Railroad. But the rally itself was held at St. Peter's Episcopal Church, where Thomas Mundy Peterson is buried. Mundy Peterson was the first Black person in the nation to vote under the provisions of the 15th Amendment of the Constitution, which was pretty cool to see this and very moving, as you can imagine, right in the churchyard. The Star Ledger came out with an editorial pretty recently calling for the Reparations Task Force bill to move forward and for hearings to be held, and which focused on Assemblywoman Shavonda Sumter, who is a lead sponsor on the bill and who we are very blessed to have with us tonight, and you will hear from very shortly. So despite all, we had 12,000 people have sent emails and tweets to our legislators, and despite all of this, last year's legislative session ended without even a hearing held on the bill. So it seems like there are many on both sides of the aisle who are afraid to say the word. And remember, we're only asking for a task force here. We're asking for a conversation. So here we are in Black History Month, 2022, as determined as ever to get this bill passed and to get a hearing held this month. We also think to look at this in terms of what's going on around the country, right? We see efforts to stifle conversation about slavery, about Black history, about truth, to prevent our kids from reading about these kind of things. So this bill, which will provoke a conversation about these issues, and it does provide for having public meetings around the state, in at least 6 public meetings where people from the community would be able to participate. So I think during times like this, it's more important than ever that New Jersey stand up, that we say the word, and that we don't stifle these conversations. What can you do? So an easy thing to do, the first level ask is you can go to 400yearsnj.org, and that will allow you to contact your legislators, and all the communications will also go to Speaker Coughlin and Senate new President Sputari, and allow you also to make phone calls to them. It will connect you directly. Phone calls are very important, and to tweet at them, which we know these days can be pretty powerful. So with that, I am going to turn it over. I hope that Assemblywoman Sumter is with us, and Assemblywoman, we are so grateful to have you here with us tonight. The Assemblywoman has been a champion on this bill. She's the lead sponsor, and hopefully she'll tell us a little more about the bill and what she needs all of us to do so that legislators can do what they need to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori, for that recount of the legislation, and thank you for the Institute's continual support of pushing this boulder uphill. I'm glad that you all are joining us in Black History Month. I'm Assemblywoman Shavonda Sumter. I'm also chair of the New Jersey Legislative Black Caucus. This bill is extremely important to us. And yes, I had the privilege of talking to Dr. Garrity and understand that it's a national check that New Jersey cannot nearly repay. We've negotiated this bill. I've been in the Assembly since 2012. There's no more negotiations to be had. It is a task force. We do task force often in the state of New Jersey. It's an 11-member task force that will in fact detail New Jersey's history and make recommendations on the types of repair that we should be undertaking. It is challenging for me as a Democrat, as an African-American woman in the state of New Jersey by way of South Carolina to be stuck in this space just to get a hearing, which is a democratic process, to get a hearing, to have the public voices on record, just like this conversation we're having today, but yet on record in our state house, the People's State House, which is where business should be conducted. As you heard earlier, higher education institutions have started pieces of repair. We've done a wealth disparities task force that the governor is undertaking, and I applaud those efforts. But really, for a comprehensive approach, we really need a task force with one document for New Jersey to note its history, also to share with the diverse population of over 48% of majority minority communities who were not necessarily born in New Jersey, but came to New Jersey. In fact, true story, when I did the article with Tom Moran and we met in Perth Amboy, he had no knowledge that the North Transatlantic slave trade stopped in Perth Amboy, and it was a major port. In fact, a gentleman walking his dog who lived in Perth Amboy all his life had no idea. I'm from Patterson. We have portions of the Underground Railroad that came through Patterson. Partnership of the Hintoon family and the Van Rensselaer family working together in partnership, biracial. So this is a rich history of New Jersey that has gone untold. And as Lori shared of some of the things happening in Virginia, trying to erase history with the new Governor Youngkin, who's come in and does not want these conversations to be had. New Jersey, we are a Democratic Assembly, a Democratic Senate, Democratic Governor's Office. If we don't talk about these things now and get it on the agenda, yes, my hopes that it will be done because we have the majorities. And I need for each of you to join in calling on my colleagues and calling on the leadership for our democratic process to take place. Slavery, in fact, wasn't partisan. So by no means am I saying that. I've invited my Republican colleagues to join me and sign on to these bills because it is a task force. Also, I want to be very prescriptive. We learned in the pandemic, and you saw in the staircase slide, which is powerful, from the Institute of Social Justice, all the steps that we are harmed as Black people. And I don't think maternal health was on that staircase, where we're still in the bottom tier of the nation for Black women to have a baby in the state of New Jersey and survive. So I know I'm going in hard and I'm sharing a lot, and these conversations are helpful because I can go back to the table and have this argument again. It is not about a consequence of blame. Let me say this again. It is not about a consequence of blame for the harms that was caused to Black people in the state of New Jersey. It is about acknowledging it, and not just from the apology of 2008, but also making sure the story is told. And that's a big part of my journey here. Also being sure that when we're talking about the wealth gap in New Jersey, that we're being very precise in how we start to look to repair the wealth gap in New Jersey and not keep using it as a soundbite with no solutions to achieving the repair. It's also about being sure that we know the number of people who may still be living who are direct descendants of the indentured servants and slaves in New Jersey that were impacted by slavery and had wealth stolen from them. So I didn't think when we started this, and Lori said it best, that it was a heavy lift. I told you, the numbers were in my favor. And I don't say that with any arrogance, but the numbers were in my favor with the number of Democrats in both houses and controlling the governor's office. So I need for us as a coalition, a faith-based coalition, a community coalition, a concerned citizen coalition, to really look to right the ship, be on the right side of history in this moment in time, be on the right side of history, where we all can advocate for a hearing, democratic process, the duties of your public officials that your tax dollars pay for, to host a hearing, to go on the record, for this bill to be heard, to establish a task force of volunteers. Did I mention that? A task force of volunteers of the public to do this work for our state, to be a public document, to be housed within our state for generations to come. I think it's important for us to, at this moment, join together, hand in hand, hold the line, and make this request. And I'll hold there.
Thank you so much, Assemblywoman, for your powerful words and your powerful leadership on this from the beginning.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much. So now I think at this time, we're going to open up our questions.
Okay. As we mentioned before, we have some folks who have sent their questions directly to me. If you have questions, it's not too late. Please feel free to put them in the chat directly to me and I will share them. What we're going to do is we're going to call on people in turn and we're going to ask you to unmute yourself and turn on your camera and read your question. So we're going to start with Michael Paris. Michael?
Hello. So thank you all for such powerful presentations. I really appreciate it. I'm glad I came. This was just really stimulating and provocative and inspiring across the board. Khalil, I had a question for you. And I guess I should, I was told I have to read this, right? I can't. I hope I formulated it. All right, so I say I'm in favor of reparations as a good strategy of political mobilization, as a strategy to fight the American pattern of willful forgetting. You know, let us begin, let's see where it goes. That's my view. It's still my view. However, I recently read a book by Tori Reid. The book's title is Toward Freedom, The Case Against Race Reductionism. I'm sure you're familiar, but you know, he makes kind of a point that's worth considering. It's about the politics of this. And he's saying, African Americans are 13% of the US population. Wouldn't it be better to frame very broad demands for social democratic policies that encompass all poor and working class people? Right now, you can say they're not mutually exclusive. I'm sorry, I'm ad-libbing a little here. But there is what you focus on and what the politics of that looks like versus focusing somewhere else and what the politics of that might look like. So this is a question. I think it's a serious question and an important one. And I was wondering what your response to that would be.
Yeah, so I haven't read Touré's book, but I'm familiar with his work broadly, and he's his father's son, Adolph Reed.
Of course.
The scientist. So, you know, so the question is born out of class politics first. So just for our audience, so we don't get too much into academic baseball. And in that spirit, it's always a question on the table about universalistic policies that are anti-poverty, that are social democratic, that are even socialistic without being socialism. This is the story of the New Deal. And I guess the question is there any precedent or context where we might believe that we could finally imagine that there would be a trickle-down distribution in a way that would not be mitigated or destroyed or watered down by either local politics or some other means through which Black people don't get their fair share. Now, just to give a little bit of historical insight into my own skepticism, I'll just add one more thing. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Eleanor were genuine, as they used to say, friends of the Negro. And there were more Black people in FDR's cabinet than had ever been and would be really until Reagan administration, which is a little bit of an irony. The problem is that FDR could not pass anti-discrimination clauses in New Deal acts because the legislation wouldn't pass. So one way or the other, the race question comes up. And so part of the point of reparations is not simply a legislative bill to agree on the actual payment or the policy. Part of the point of reparations is to socialize white Americans to what actually happened. Because as we've all acknowledged and we're all bearing witness to, there are a lot of white Americans who simply don't believe what we say is actually true. They know slavery was bad, but beyond that, they think, you know, the rest of it is just kind of an exaggeration. And if they don't think it's an exaggeration, they think white people had it bad too. You know, I'm a scholar of European immigration. I can't tell you how many Italians or Irish think like, you, me, the same, right? As the scene from Do the Right Thing. So part of this work is fundamentally about getting to the truth of the history. And while it may not make it into the hearts of people who are our age on this call today, it can make a difference for future generations. And there and then we could imagine those universalistic policies, because people would have a different understanding of who we are as a nation, what we should be, and what we need to do to ensure that we live up to our values.
Thank you, Khalil, and thank you, Michael. Lori or Assemblywoman Sumter, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think, I'm sorry, I just think that was well stated, because part of what I struggle with in the legislature is the belief that we are now fine. We have a Black president. We had a Black president. We have a Black vice president, female. What are the harms? I'm sitting in the legislature now, and it was not my fault. There were struggles. We should be able to move forward. Are people still living who would have a say? And can we afford to pay the bill? Those are the conversations that I'm having. And then the last one that I will add is the fear that it doesn't poll well. A lot of politicals like to rely on polling. And Massachusetts, there was a poll. If you ask a person, do you think Black people should have reparations? The answer will be no. But do you think there should be some repair for the harms caused to Black people? Overuse of force, over policing. If you hit specific line items, segregated schools, redlining for housing, people will answer differently. So it's how you pose those questions, who's doing the polling. So what I really need for groups like these to do is really letter writing campaigns, as the Institute of Social Justice has available, to elevate that there is some public interest in this issue of a task force for New Jersey. And thank you for allowing me just to share those few words.
Yeah, and then I'll just add, I'm going to, hopefully you'll indulge me to take that question, to use it to pivot a little bit in my answer. The question was about whether we should have a universality in the recipients of reparations, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of white people in this, in terms of making reparations for Black people happen. Because I believe, for those of us who are white, that we have a particularly pressing obligation to be part of this movement and to participate in this. As we're watching, you know, about history and slavery, we hear people trying to get people to learn about things. We hear it's going to make white people feel guilty. Our kids are going to feel ashamed. Our kids are going to feel uncomfortable. We can't do that. And I think we have to really get real with ourselves. So it's true that those of us alive today obviously didn't start the institution of slavery, but it is really true, as Reverend Anya said so eloquently, that we do benefit from it every single day. Slavery and its aftermath, and the generations of structural racism that we're talking about, in ways that we're not even conscious of, because they're so in the water that we swim in that you don't even realize it in a conscious way. But it's also true, like the Assemblywoman so eloquently put, it's not about blame. This isn't about shame. It's simply about telling the truth and accountability. And frankly, that, I mean, to me personally, that feels freeing, and that's freeing for everybody. And I don't see acknowledging that as an act of self-loathing, but simply an act of self-reflection and integrity and grace. And so forgive me for taking the question in that direction, but I did think that it needed to be said. And so we hope all of you will join us in saying the word.
Thank you, Lori. And I want to just acknowledge Assemblywoman Sumter has to leave us, and thank you so much for being here, Assemblywoman. Your words are so powerful. We're really grateful that you could join us. And the Assemblywoman has invited me to share her email in the chat, so I'm going to do that now. So here it is, and thank you so much. Okay, moving to our next question, I'm going to invite Janine Babakian, and I apologize if I have messed up your name, but Janine, can I invite you to read your question?
Hi, thank you. You did very well on the pronunciation. It's not written down, but I basically, you were discussing other reparations task forces in other states. And yet at the same time, you also discussed that really the money has to come from the federal government. So I was just wondering if there is any communication or collaboration among these different task forces in other states, and what, of course, that also probably should have been directed to the Assemblywoman, but anyway, if you can shed any light on that and whether that's helpful, that would be great. Thank you. Oh, and thank you very much for the program. It's really wonderful.
I'll take a quick stab at it. It's a good question, and I think the point is that we probably should have a national reparations process first and foremost, and whatever remains of it would take place at the local and state level. But of course, this is America. so you know, you could either wait for Congress to decide to do something meaningful and impactful and important, or you could get started at the local and state level. But the numbers that I described are the totality of it all. So one could imagine that New Jersey, through a task force process such as the one that is sitting with the legislature, would understand its own particular role for its own particular citizens, and therefore the number would be smaller. And you know, again, I can't get ahead of myself, but one could imagine that perhaps if every state got its act together, then that would be a credit towards the debt that the feds came up with, and so it would be a wash. You know, I'm just imagining possibilities here.
Yeah, I mean, I would answer the same thing. I think in our world of wildest dreams, so if New Jersey did this and reparations were granted from the state, there's no reason that when the federal government steps up to the plate that can't be supplemented, but it's urgent. And I think if we look at Washington, D.C. right now, it's hard to see anything like that happening, unfortunately, anytime soon. So yeah. And also just to add that part of what the task force would do, in addition to that direct financial remuneration, would be policies that would invest in communities of color in a targeted, direct way.
Thank you so much, both of you. We did have a question from one of our moderators, Barbara. It was specifically about the reparations task force, and I wondered if you wanted to ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, as the Assemblywoman mentioned that the reparations program would kind of be for people who were descended from slaves in New Jersey, which I find a little concerning, because that's what also they're doing in Evanston with their program. Is for people, I think, for 100 years have lived in Evanston. However, I live in New Jersey and my family comes from Tennessee. Good luck trying to get them to pass a reparations bill. So I'm just curious, I'm throwing the question out there, would this be for people who could trace their I mean, because I am into genealogy as well, trace their families back to slavery, but you don't have to actually live in the place where your ancestors may have been enslaved.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that really is what would come out of the reparations task force. These questions are complicated. They're multi-layered.
I meant to say that I know that it would come out of that, but I was just wondering what your thoughts were.
Yeah, I mean, they're very real questions. And I think it would be putting the cart before the horse to answer that in a definitive way now. I think that the task force would have to study exactly what pool of the population we were dealing with, what pool falls into what category, what pool of funds there is, what the impact has been from certain policies on different populations.
And I'll just say very quickly, I mean, one could imagine out of a task force process would be a stepped set of benefits based on when you were subject to structural racism and harm. This is why it's really important, I think, to move past reparations simply being about slavery as the basis of the harm. It's the original sin, but the harm continued. And so in the case of someone arriving in the World War II period and being trapped in disinvested communities for no reason of their own, other than the fact that you were redlined out or chased out by violence because you can't live somewhere else, to me is the basis in New Jersey for a repair and or a redress.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Abdul, I do see you. I have one person ahead of you, and I wanted to just get to Shakira Abdullah Ali. Would you unmute and ask your question, please?
Yes, is it possible to allow the person you just mentioned to go ahead of me? I'm just walking into my home and I'd like to be settled before I ask my question. Is that possible?
Absolutely. Abdul,
Great.
go ahead, and Shakira
Thank
will
you.
come back to you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned earlier about the government being responsible for the payment for reparations, whereas also historically, as a point of fact, many of the banks and corporations and insurance companies that are the backbone, the financial backbone of this country today, had their start in financing slave ships, financing the slave trade. Insurance companies did, banks did. Wall Street historically got its start during the slave trade. So aside from just the banks, and this question, probably I would address this question to Khalil, aside from expecting the government to shoulder the financial responsibility of this, what about the corporations, the banks and the corporations like the city banks and the Banks of America of the world, and the insurance companies like New York Life and others, who were responsible for ensuring the ships and financing of the ships and what have you during the slave trade?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. So in my presentation about a precedence for it, I often talk about the fact that New York Life in particular did its own truth-telling and revealed sometime in the late 1990s and early 2000s that it had written numerous insurance policies on enslaved people, and that it was really a subsidiary of New York Life at the time, but that it had been acquired over the years, and that it had been a source of great revenue and wealth for the company. When this was discovered, they tried to figure out how to make amends for it, and I'm telling this story because it's specific. They did two things. Well, two things I'm aware of that are significant. One, they gave the archives of the evidence to the Schomburg Center so that it could be studied in perpetuity. And secondly, due to some lobbying and support from Charlie Rangel, then congressman, and my predecessor, Howard Dotson, gave a $2 million gift to help educate students at the Schomburg Center. A program became Junior Scholars. Anyone who knows me when I was running Schomburg constantly talked about the importance of Junior Scholars. So that's a precedent, and it's an example, and one could probably find similar stories manifested in different ways for the private sector. The problem, of course, is that the federal government can't make the private sector do anything, so let alone not pollute and destroy Earth. So there's two problems. The regulatory apparatus that would be able to identify the particular harms of a particular set of private actors might even be more complicated than simply tallying the toll that the federal government was directly responsible for. The second problem is that as wealthy as these companies are, they're not wealthy enough to fit the bill at least that's on the table right now. And so I guess a way to answer your question is, thank you for mentioning it, because it's a part of the story and it's an important part of the story. And then secondarily, in a perfect world, it would be a both and. The private sector would find a mechanism and a means to make reparations for its harms, along with various state actors.
Thank you. Now we'll turn things over to Shakira Abdullah Ali for her question.
Hi, I have I'm showing up on my computer screen, but I'm keeping my phone open so I can read my question because I'll forget. It seems to me that one reason New Jersey has over 500 plus municipalities is because of white flight. It led to the creation of all of those municipalities as white families sought to prevent their kids from being in school with Black kids, among other things. The NAACP is seeking legal redress from segregated schools here in New Jersey now. So one of the things that has occurred to me is that it might be possible for residents of New Jersey to significantly save on resources spent if we reduce the number of municipalities in the state, so that there would be available resources for repair of the descendants of Africans, of enslaved Africans. When I think about the fact that, you know, we have over 500 superintendents of schools, we have 500 plus police departments and municipal buildings, and I mean, just an enormous waste of resources, in my estimation, for such a densely populated state. And I'm just wondering if that might be incentive there might be an incentive for us to seek to, you know, rationalize what we're spending, and you know, that would make a way for the resources to repair Black folk. And I guess Lori, maybe that's your question.
Yeah. I mean, you're certainly not the first person to sort of take issue with the fact that kind of in New Jersey, it seems like every time you turn the corner, you're in a new school district, and I think that's a very thoughtful question, and I mean, sure, you know, I don't know that would happen through the Reparations Task Force, but I think that's a reasonable thing for New Jersey to look at. That's me talking, not the Institute. And among many, many other ways that I'm sure New Jersey spends money that it could spend a lot less money on. You know, we always say whenever we have any sort of legislation that requires money, the answer is always, there's no money, there's no budget. But we all know that a budget represents our values, and when it's something that any government entity wants to get done, they manage to find the money. So thank you for that question, and yeah, sure, why not?
I just say quickly, I love, Laura, you putting it back on the task force, because these incredible questions are exactly why a task force is being impaneled, and why it's totally absurd that this should be held up in legislative sessions as somehow not worthy of moving forward. I mean, Governor Murphy got reelected, so one could imagine that when this movement started before his reelection, he did almost lose to Chitterelli. It's pretty remarkable to think about. So maybe that was the right political decision to make. But now, you know, let's get busy, right? And I just want to add to this point about white flight you mentioned. There's even the very specific concrete evidence, pardon the pun, of the routing of interstate highway systems, which absolutely destroyed Black economic wealth in the state of New Jersey.
Yes.
So there's so many entry points and on-ramps to being able to tally and specifically understand both the municipal spread that is ridiculous in the state, and also the particular contours of the borders that exist in this state that were consistently at the expense of Black communities.
Yes. Yeah. True. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both Lori and Khalil, for those thoughtful responses, and to everyone who asked those questions. I know that we have a couple of extra questions in the chat that we haven't gotten to. Our apologies. We always have more questions than we're able to field in the moment, but because of time, I'm going to hand things over to our panelists to wrap things up briefly. So, Lori, would you like to wrap up?
Sure, and I won't take too long. I just first wanted to thank the coalition for having us on tonight. I've thoroughly enjoyed having this conversation and really, really appreciate the thoughtful questions and engagement. I just wanted to let you know, if you have further questions that you want to direct through the Institute, feel free to email me at L Beacham, LBEACHAM at njisj.org, and we'll do our best to help. And I'd be remiss if I didn't end by saying, say the word and go to 400yearsnj.org, and please take action and join the movement. Thank you.
And I'll just say thank you so much for doing this. Brian Haygood, the director of the New Jersey Institute of Social Justice, is working with so many amazing people like Lori and so many others, and Assemblywoman Sumter, and a lot of community members and activists to do this work for us. And so I said to him about a year ago, I thought it would be really wonderful if he could activate a community like South Orange Maplewood that very proudly wears its liberal credentials on its sleeve. And this is not a battle that can be won with simply Black people carrying this charge on their own. White people are going to have to agree to do this work and to push for this work. And so I would love to see this community of South Orange and Maplewood be on the front lines of battling for this task force and eventually for reparations. And I just want to also shout out my wife, Stephanie Lawson Muhammad, who is also creating bridges through an organization she started called Erasing Essex Borders. And she's helping to uncover these histories and to be part of helping people to see that the society we live in today is owed to this past, but also doesn't have to be the same society going into the future. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Khalil. So now I'll turn things over to Kelly Quirk, who is the chair of the board of the Community Coalition on Race, to close us out. Kelly?
Sure. I want to thank all of you for coming to this panel and learning opportunity on reparations and what that looks like in New Jersey. I want to thank our guests and panelists, the Honorable Assemblyperson Sumter, Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, Lori Beacham of the NJ Institute for Social Justice. I noticed Ryan Haygood has joined us, so I'd like to thank him as the director of the NJ Institute for Social Justice. I'd love if all of us could take action. You know, this is a co-sponsored event between SOMA Action and the South Orange Maplewood Community Coalition on Race, and we believe in action. There are a number of links in the chat for folks to look up next steps, where to go, and what to sign up for. There's also emails in the chat, and there's a chance to learn more about SOMA Action, the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, and the Community Coalition on Race. I especially want to thank our trustees, Antoine Green and Barbara Velasquez, our program director, Audrey Rowe, Tegan Culler, who is our Zoom master, and our executive director, Nancy Gagne, and announce a couple of things. We have some events coming up for Black History Month. We have 2 trivia nights, which is a great opportunity to sit with your family. It is Zoom and COVID friendly in that way. And so you can go on our website to sign up for those if you go to events on our website. We also upcoming have our 25 years. So the Community Coalition on Race has been about intentional racial integration and true inclusion for over 25 years. And we are going to have an event that talks about the history of this organization and our work on integration in our community coming up. I also want to invite you to join our mailing list and learn more about our other work, including the upcoming reports that the coalition will be issuing on what race and integration and segregation look like in our community, and also learn more about our upcoming wealth gap equalizer loan. And if you'd like, after you leave tonight, you're going to see a survey about your experience, and we'd ask you to complete it. It really does help us determine how these events are working for folks and what we can do better in the future. So again, I want to thank you all for coming to this topic on reparations. I want you to please join us for other Black History Month events, but join us through the rest of the months and through the rest of the year in dedicating your time and energy towards this cause, towards ending racial harm in our community, but also the state of New Jersey.